Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Allison Wills, and thank you so much for attending this webinar on best practices for Canadian Patient Support Program enrollment forms. We're just going to give everyone about 1 or 2 minutes to log in. I see a bunch of folks coming on the line. So yeah, get settled and we'll start in just 1 minute. We're going to be using the chat function today. I'm going to put something in there for you right now, and I hope you can all see it. And if you'd like, you can throw a thumbs up in the chat for me or just a little wave or hello if you're able to access the chat. All right, thank you. I already see a couple of thumbs up. That's great. Okay, got it. Awesome. Okay, just 1 more minute and then we'll get started. Okay, let's get going. So again, welcome everyone. My name is Allison Wills from 20Sense. And thank you so much for joining us for this webinar called Best Practices for Canadian Patient Support Program Enrollment Forms, Research Findings, Presentation, and Expert Panel Discussion. So get yourself comfortable. And yes, I see a note in the chat. If somebody's registered and not able to join, there will be a recording. This recording and all the materials will be available to you after the session. And we're going to make it available publicly quite broadly. So even if they didn't register, people can have access to the materials. All right, so let's get going. So for today's agenda, we're going to be doing a little bit of housekeeping and the panelist introductions, followed by answering the question, why conduct research on patient support program enrollment forms? And then we're going to look at two documents. One is the research findings on Canadian Patient Support Program enrollment form standardization opportunities. And the second, number 4, are best practices, which are considerations when developing patient support program enrollment forms. This will be followed by a panel discussion. We have 4 fantastic panelists that are with us today to talk about this. And then we want to hear from you, the audience. So audience questions. And really, this is the main housekeeping point, is that I invite you to use the chat function to ask your questions. Okay, so you're not able to unmute or put yourselves on video. We have a large group today, but please do use the chat function. We'll be monitoring the chat and then answering the questions throughout the session today. And then finally, where to find resources, and we'll close the webinar. So this should be about 90 minutes. We have a lot of time for the panelist discussion and to answer your questions. So I look forward to this being an interactive session with all of you, and then we can learn a little bit more about PSP enrollment form best practices. Okay, just one thing here, as this is research that we're presenting. So we have some research disclosures. So myself and my colleague Arif Mitha, who's on the line, are going to be presenting the findings. And we just want to let you know that we are employees and owners of 20Sense, which is a Canadian pharmaceutical research and consulting company. And we co-chair the Patient Support Program Leaders Forum. So the research funding for these initiatives was provided by members of that forum from 2024 and 2025, and that included AbbVie, Alexion, AstraZeneca, Bayer, Eli Lilly, EMD Serono, Gilead, Otsuka, Pfizer, and Roche. And really importantly, and a shout out here, is that the research was conducted in collaboration with the University of Toronto Healthcare Engineering Department. So for this work, we had 4 engineering students that were assigned to the project as their 4th-year capstone project. So that was fantastic to have them with us along the way through the research. Okay, just to call out, what is the Patient Support Program Leaders Forum? This is a research-driven collaborative setting for Canadian pharmaceutical manufacturer PSP leaders to advance capabilities, expertise, knowledge, to best support positive outcomes and access for patients. So this group has been running for a number of years now. I think we're in the 4th or 5th year. And our focus in 2025 is on PSP data, so conducting research on PSP data use and potential to support PSP data readiness and acceptability for all Canadian stakeholders, and on patient support program best practices. So creating best practices to inform standards for PSPs to enable healthcare system efficiencies. So the work you're seeing today is work that was funded, and there was research support from this group. So I want to really give a huge thanks to all the different members involved here. And at the end, I'm going to show you some other resources that have been published over the years from this initiative and that is accessible to you online. Okay, so let's get into it. I would first like to introduce our panelists. So I'm going to invite each of you to come on, or all four of you can, put your cameras on, unmute yourselves. And I just would like Julien, Lisa, Alan, and Dorothy, if you could introduce yourselves and just answer this question. So what is your experience with patient support program enrollment forms? And Julien, I'll kick it off to you first since your picture appears first.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Julien Chaumillon, Patient Support Program Manager for Pfizer Canada's Oncology Division. So my experience being on the manufacturer side of things, my role is called to develop enrollment forms with the help of a creative agency, obviously, and then put the approved documents in the hands of drug access navigators, nurses, or physicians so that the enrollment process can begin for patients into our program.
Okay, thanks, Julien. Lisa, over to you.
Great. Hello, everybody. My name is Lisa Machado. I'm the founder of the Canadian CML Network. I'm also a patient. So obviously, first off, my experience with patient support programs and the enrollment forms has to do mostly as a patient, but also helping other patients and over the years, helping clinicians as well figure them out. So really happy to be here. Thanks, Allison.
Hey, fantastic. Thank you. Welcome. Alan Birch, over to you.
Allison. Hi, everybody. So my name's Alan Birch. So I was a drug access navigator at North York General Hospital for almost 10 years. And then I joined Sentrex and I started a patient support program here of my own called Haven. And my experience with patient support program enrollment forms is completing probably hundreds and hundreds of them over the years, several a day for almost a decade. So quite a lot of experience working with them over a long time.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Alan. And last but not least, Dorothy.
Hi, everybody. Dorothy Czylyski. Thank you for having me, Allison. I'm the founder and president of No Fixed Address Health, NFA Health, which is a strategic and creative agency supporting a wide range of pharmaceutical brands, including their patient support programs. And as part of our engagements with various pharmaceutical clients, we do design and create the PSP enrollment form themselves. And find that obviously, apart from the fact that it's a way that patients access their specialty medications, the forms are also a way of obtaining consent from the patients for communicating with them afterwards. So things like email marketing, sending up follow-up materials, consenting to market research, collecting real-world data, things like that, all of which we are also a part of as well.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. And that's great start and great introduction. So if you like, you can just turn off your cameras for now, and I'll call you back after we present the research findings. So enjoy. All right, so now I'm going to ask my colleague Arif to come online as well. And okay, I'm going to take you through a little bit of, why are we conducting research on PSP enrollment form standardization, and what are the opportunities to develop best practices. So I think a lot of you on the line are familiar with PSPs, but I'll just go quickly over this. So patient support programs help patients navigate the clinical and logistical challenges of treatment with specialized medicines. In Canada, we have about an estimated 400 PSPs, probably more. And each PSP has a unique enrollment form. Enrolling the patient in the PSP is a key step to enable the patient to access its PSP services and to initiate treatment. To enroll a patient, healthcare personnel find the PSP enrollment form for the prescribed drug. They then fill in the form and submit it to the corresponding patient support program. The PSP vendor receives the form and enters the data to enroll the patient in the PSP, and the enrollment form is also key for collecting the patient's baseline data, which are at times used for real-world evidence generation. So really key here is that each PSP has its own form, and it's estimated that there's hundreds of enrollment forms being used in Canada today. Enrollment forms are not standardized despite collecting similar information. So our research question and our hypothesis was that PSP enrollment form standardization could create efficiencies for healthcare systems and stakeholders. Some of the potential advantages of standardization could include increased efficiency in completing the forms, and improved quality of information collected in the forms. And as I mentioned, these data are often used for data analysis, which is critical for the generation of real-world evidence from PSPs. So if there's one thing I want you to keep in mind, is that PSP enrollment form standardization could create efficiencies for healthcare systems and stakeholders. And already hearing Alan say that he's finding and filling out tens of forms a day in his previous life of a drug access navigator sort of points to the lack of efficiencies that currently exist in this space. So this is what we're looking at with the research. So let's get into it. First, we're going to take you through the research findings on Canadian PSP enrollment form standardization opportunities. Okay, so Arif, I'm going to pass it over to you. Take it away.
Perfect. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Arif. So this study aimed to identify areas of opportunity for standardization of the enrollment forms. So we looked at 3 therapeutic areas: multiple sclerosis, oncology, and RA. We picked 3. Oncology, we picked first because it's the largest, and most manufacturers have drugs in that area. And then we picked 2 more so that we could do a comparison across therapeutic areas. Okay, so first step of the project was gathering the forms for the analysis. It was a big step. For each therapeutic area, a formal source was used to identify all existing drugs with a PSP. So what's the denominator? How many forms or drugs are we talking about? So that resulted in 167 drugs, and you can see the table on the right. So for each therapeutic area, so for MS, for example, there were 19 drugs. I'll just work backwards on this table. There were 19 drugs. We collected 14 forms, and on those forms were 17 drugs. So a form can have more than one drug. So 17 divided by 19, 89%. So we had 89% of the drugs, forms for 89% of the drugs. I'll read the second line, rheumatoid arthritis, because you'll notice, so there's 17 drugs, and we have 21 forms. So also a drug can have multiple forms, so 1 per indication. So in that case for RA, there was 21 forms. So overall, we had 107 forms of the 167 for all 3 therapeutic areas, 89% of the forms. Some of the criteria as well, I'll mention, this is only innovator drugs, so not biosimilar drugs. So we didn't look at those forms. And the one exception was in oncology if there was no innovator drug. So the innovator drug had been discontinued and there was only a generic drug, then we used that form. The forms were obtained directly from manufacturers in most cases or accessed online. All source forms for RA and MS were included in the analysis. So we looked at all 14 MS forms, all 21 RA forms. For oncology, due to the large number of forms, the students used a saturation method. I won't explain what that is, but basically of the 72 forms, they looked at 52 of them. So I will explain a little bit. So they keep looking at forms randomly until there's no new information, and then they stop. So they got the 52 forms. So quite a few of the 72. So analysis was performed on the enrollment forms to determine if the forms were collecting the same information, including, we looked at sections, section names, fields within each section, and these were all listed in Excel. And analysis was performed on the opportunity for standardization. So students used comparison analysis, identified similarities and differences within and across therapeutic areas. Also, we interviewed key stakeholders, so healthcare people. We interviewed drug access navigators and one of the MS clinics, as well as 2 patient support program vendors, just to understand the enrollment form process. Okay, number 1, just to give everyone the same, what do these forms look like? So in general, almost 100%, but not 100%. Page 1 of the enrollment form was broken down into sections, as you can see in the diagram on the right. So patient information, medical information, consent, and so on. And then page 2 had the detailed consent information. So it wasn't 100%, but some cases there were 3-page enrollment forms. Sometimes the consent was page 1. And there were some variations, but almost all cases was this format. Okay, the next section, getting into the data part of it. So types of information and corresponding section names on enrollment forms. So the forms, you can imagine with 107 forms and the state of the forms, there was quite a bit of variability. So how to analyze them was important. So on the right, you can see there were 10 types of information being collected. Patient information, patient consent, prescription, physician information, and so on. So across all therapeutic areas, there were the 10, and each form section was aligned to one of these types. The section naming was inconsistent across enrollment forms within each TA and across TAs, and on the next page we have examples. Only patient information was on 100% of the form, so that they all had a patient information section. The other types were inconsistent, so they weren't on all the forms. So some types appeared in, some of the types on the right, those 10 sections, appeared on most enrollment forms, like greater than 80%, but in others, there were pretty significant variances and they were inconsistent across therapeutic areas. We'll show you the examples on the next page just to make it real. Yeah, let's go to the next page, Allison. Thank you. So of the 10 sections, we've only shown the first 4. And I'll explain the table. So let's go through patient information. Number 1, across the top are the 3 therapeutic areas, so MS, RA, and oncology. So in MS, patient information was on 100% of the forms, and it was actually called patient information, that bolded part. Same thing for RA, 21 out of 21 had a patient information section, and it was called patient information. Then when we go to oncology, there starts to be some variation. So patient information was called patient information on 48 of the 52 forms that were analyzed. And then it started being, the rest of the 4 forms were called something else: patient information and consent, patient demographics, or not specified. Let's go to a more complicated one. Let's go to the prescription one on the right, number 3. So in MS, prescription was called prescription information on 7 of the 14 forms. It was called physician orders on 2 of the forms, prescribing physician pharmacy use on 2 of the forms, prescription on a form, and RX information on a form, 1 form. And it was missing on 1 form. That's why it's only at 93%. And then you can see on that table across oncology, as an example, there's even more variation. And these 4 sections were probably the most straightforward when we get into the other 6 sections. When we looked at the other 6 sections, there was quite a bit of variance, and including the section was not on the form. So the key takeaway here is the section names were inconsistent. So a good opportunity for standardization. So if there is a prescription, if the standardization would be all the forms would call it prescription information. Good. Let's go to the next page. So those were the section titles. So was there a section and what was the title? Now looking at the fields within each section. And this was, again, it got very complex. we're just looking at on this page MS and the patient information section, just as an example of what we saw. Only 3 fields, probably easiest to read the graph on the right, only the first 3 fields were on all 14 of the MS form. So name, contact, and address were on all 14. Then it started to drop. Date of birth was only on 13 forms. Gender was on 12 forms. Permission to leave voice message on 9 forms. Language on 6 forms. Health card was on 4 forms. So it started to vary quite a bit. And even though phone number was on all 14 forms, the way it was asked, the format of it was quite different. So just to read some of the examples, primary and secondary phone numbers was what it was called. 2 numbers with check boxes next to them for preferred phone number, 3 phone numbers, home, cell, work. Can we leave a voice message, caregiver, alternate, best number to be contacted? So there's quite a bit of variation. So even though phone number was there was a lot of variation of how it was asked.
It's funny to think how many ways are there to ask for a phone number? There are many. We're learning through the forms.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's go to the next page. So just continuing on that same MS patient information section, fields do not appear consistently in the same section across enrollment forms. So medical information fields were in the patient information section, which was on that graph on the previous slide. So for example, previous DMTs, the previous disease modifying therapies, like which drug was the patient on previously, number of relapses, EDSS score, which is a score for MS patients. But these are all medical fields, and they were within the patient information section sometimes. EDSS score, for example, appeared in 6 different sections across the 14 forms, including patient information, patient assessment, medical information, quick start was a section name, and was absent on 3 enrollment forms. So quite a bit of variation, and these are all MS drugs. Other observations, the fields formats were inconsistent. So for dates and phone numbers, including there was no format specified. You can imagine a healthcare professional filling it out, finding the form and finding the date field, date of birth, for example, and then having to see what format that form wanted the date in if it was specified. And the last point there, form layouts and use of colors were inconsistent across forms. For example, one form indicated steps 1 through 6 as its section. The key takeaway was, having fields that correspond to the section title, only having those fields in that section would make, a good opportunity for standardization to make the healthcare folks filling out the form easier to go through. The next slide. So conclusions, much of the same information was being collected on the enrollment forms, both within the therapeutic area and across the 3 therapeutic areas. However, there were significant differences in the forms, including the section names, fields in the sections, the format of the fields, and the general format of the enrollment form. So there is an opportunity to standardize parts of the form while still allowing for flexibility in the form to account for differences that do exist across therapeutic areas, drugs, and patient support program like services. Some of the points we discussed, current inconsistencies observed can be attributed, we're thinking, to the growth in number of PSPs over the past 20 years, right? That has led to now 400. So now, when to start, there's only a few, but now there's 400. So it's just evolved to the state it's in. There's a lack of standards for enrollment form design and content, and enrollment forms being seen as a potential vehicle for branded marketing tools to create PSP differentiation instead of an operational tool impacting health system processes and stakeholders. So the opportunity exists to improve the PSP enrollment form usability and process efficiencies for the health care system stakeholders. And also this improvement would enable a higher quality of data collection, which could in turn support more robust real-world data collection and evidence generation from PSP. So that form is the key vehicle, the enrollment form, to collect the baseline data for patients and making sure, it's legible, it's accurate, there's no missing data, so on, is really important to collect that baseline information for real-world data studies.
Okay, thanks so much, Arif. So now we'd love to take some questions from the audience, and already kudos to you guys on the line. That was the most dense part of the presentation. So this analysis of 107 forms. I see one question that's come in. It said, so did you notice consent fields to capture HCP consent into the PSP? So I'll just repeat that. Did you notice consent fields to capture HCP consent into the PSP?
Question for me, I assume?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, definitely there was a signature, but there was a lot of variation. Sometimes the HCP consent did on the second page. Sometimes it just had the text there with the heading of HCP consent. Sometimes it was there with a signature spot. And sometimes there wasn't. There was just a spot on the first page for HCP consent, sometimes combined with the prescription, sometimes twice on the first page. There was a lot of variation.
Okay, thanks for that. And yeah, we showed you the four, those really complex charts. Actually, I'll go back to it. So we did do for each of the sections, looking at consent as well on this. It just isn't, there's a lot of information to show you guys in here. But if anybody has specific questions, just shoot me an email and we can go look into what, specific part of the consent you're interested in. Okay, so next question. Curious to know, in this study, were the manufacturers for each therapeutic area disclosed?
We didn't disclose any one form looked this way. It was all aggregated results that you saw. So there's no manufacturers disclosed. There's probably nothing to hide. The percentages of forms were really high. So there were for MS, it's almost all the MS manufacturers, because almost all the forms were captured. In RA, it was all of the manufacturers with RA drugs with PSPs. In oncology, it was fairly high as well, 87%. So there was quite a long manufacturer list.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Were you able to determine if any specific inconsistencies were attributed to delayed enrollment?
Yeah,
That's
definitely
for the next project, right?
Next project, yeah, we definitely asked the question to the PSP vendors, and there's no specific tracking being done. Just, if there is missing information, there's back and forth that happens with the patient and HCP, but there's no tracking of how long or how many times the back and forth is.
Mm-hmm. Or
Yeah,
maybe
ideally,
you can, or go ahead.
Ideally, everything's measured, and then, you make a change on your form, and then, you see if you measure it again, see if there's been an improvement or not. But there's no measurement being done today that we came across.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Did you notice if there was any indication that consent had to be wet signature versus verbal?
I think just from interviews, like manufacturers said that was an option sometimes to get a verbal consent.
Do you
over the
remember on the
phone,
forms if there was anything
some of the
specific on
forms
that?
did have verbal consent. Yeah.
Okay, good. A couple more questions here. Were digital enrollment pages in scope for this analysis?
Almost all the forms were in PDF, like looking online, but not anything more digital than that. And I think in the best practices, when we get to them, yeah, definitely we recommended capturing the data digitally has advantages. But yeah, we didn't, the best practices in the analysis were not related to digital.
Okay, great. Next question. Is it common for the enrollment forms or consents to include language to contact the patients for future research studies by the company?
So that would be in the consent. And we are looking on we're doing a separate project right now on consent. And I did see that in some consents where they asked for the patient would be consenting in that one big consent to being contacted for a survey, as an example, later on.
Yeah, that's a little bit out of scope of this,
It's out of scope, yeah.
this research initiative, but for the person who asked that question, feel free to reach out because we've done some analysis around specifically patient support programs that were used to generate peer-reviewed publications, like real-world data publications. So that's in the public domain. And then we went back and looked at enrollment forms. There's about 20 publications and 20 forms that we've looked at to see what the language was around consent. So that hasn't been published in like an academic publication yet, but we do have some information on that. So feel free to reach out. Okay, question here from Charlotte. If we were designing a new enrollment form for a new drug, what do you recommend to include so that it can be more standardized? Charlotte, we're going to answer that right now in the best practices section of this presentation. So just hold on, we'll get to that. From Michael, did you look at whether or not enrollment forms were accompanied with additional patient records or additional documentation?
No, we didn't look at that, but I do know forms sometimes requests additional information.
Okay, great. Will you later inform us which are the most common terms used so we can all align moving forward? Yes, we're going to look at the best practices in just a moment. So next one, not a question, more of a comment. It would be interesting to conduct this research with special and prior authorization forms. There's a lot of variability with private insurances. It would be nice to have standardization across these forms. Thank you so much for that comment. I think that was something that came up when we were doing this research, is that looking at the opportunities for standardization within PSPs could be mirrored within PA forms for private insurers. So yeah, like stay tuned for that. I think that perhaps we could apply this methodology to that, or help others who are looking to apply this type of methodology to looking at form consistencies or inconsistencies. All right, keep going here. Was there any investigation of what information was preferred by the HCPs completing the EFs? Did they have preferences for the layout? A lot of thumbs up and hearts on this question, Arif.
We did ask the MS clinic, like, what was your favorite form? And so we did see it. So what was their favorite form? But the question was what they believe is clinically necessary. So we didn't ask that. Probably going to get many answers if you ask many doctors. But yeah, they, in general, I think they were just strapped on time, want to do it as quick as possible. The good thing was they all do it because the enrollment form is necessary to enroll the patient into the program. So they all fill it out. But yeah, just from what we heard, there's a lot of variation by doctor. Even how each doctor, their process for filling out the forms varies quite a bit. Even when we interviewed it was 4 or 5 Dans, they all had their own process in what they did to fill out the enrollment form. In the MS clinic, first step, they find the form on their drive and they print it off. That was the first step, not like type in the information. So we were thinking there's just going to be a lot of variation by clinic, by doctor.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm just saving that question, and we'll ask it again to Alan in the Q&A when we come back. So thank you for that. Yeah, some of these would be appropriate more for our panelists. I think maybe similar, this question from Charlotte. I recently spoke to 7 drug navigators across the country, and they all wanted the form to be short and concise. What do you recommend to exclude? What is extra and non-needed? We'll look again at the best practices, and let's come back to this question. I've saved it again, Charlotte, for when we bring Alan as well back in. Okay, did you see much separate consent for RWE, etc.?
So this project was not looking at the second page, the consent. It's out of scope. We're running a project right now looking at the consent.
Okay, perfect. Next question. As a daughter caring for her mother suffering from RA, I want to know if there are any promising new therapies or clinical trials for RA patients. Also, what are the long-term effects of RA medications or biologic, methotrexate or biologic? I'm so sorry. This isn't that, we don't have that information. This is the research part. But if you want, I can try to find the right person to answer that question for you. Okay, question here. Did you speak to doctors to find out their opinion on what they believe is clinically necessary to start therapy versus what PSPs want to know? 10 thumbs up on this question. So again, did you speak to doctors to find out their opinion on what they believe is clinically necessary to start therapy versus what PSPs want to know?
Yeah, unfortunately, no, we didn't. We did not ask doctors.
Great questions, though, from everyone. You're giving us new ideas, things that we need to dig into. Okay, PSP forms can be standardized using AI, allowing them to be generated in multiple languages and even enabling the creation of voice-enabled PSP forms for greater accessibility and ease of use. Just some thumbs up, a statement, not a question. I'll keep going. So are there opportunities to use AI to develop standardized enrollment forms? Let's answer that when we have the panelists. And okay, I'm just going to scan so we can come on the next area. So curious to understand, perhaps it's in the data that was already presented. What percentage of information requested is every PSP manufacturer program service offering specific? How much of the form must be allocated to the program specific questions required? I'm not sure that I completely understand this. What percent of the information requested is PSP manufacturer program service offering specific? How much of the form must be allocated to the program specific questions that is required?
Yeah, we didn't calculate the specifics, but we did, when the conclusion was standardized parts of the form and leaving others like open to variability. So we did see certain drugs that required certain questions. We didn't measure the percentage though, but there were things that were specific to drugs, to therapeutic areas, and to programs.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for all these questions. Just for time, we're going to keep moving on to show you that best practices were developed, and also I see some nice conversation going on in the chat as well. So for some questions, there's some answers being provided in there. So as you can see, what we did was do this academic work to look at the enrollment forms from a methodological standardized way to be able to pull out the consistencies and inconsistencies and understand what's going on in current state in the forms. So after going through that initiative and working with various stakeholders, we thought, well, what can we do with this data? And the biggest opportunity that we saw was to create some best practices, which are considerations when developing patient support program enrollment forms. So we're going to take you through this document, both the research that you just saw and also this best practices that we're going to show you have been published already. And I shared the link to that, also linked here. So I'll just go over the purpose of this, and then I'll invite Arif back to go over the best practices that we've put together here. So these best practices for Canadian PSP enrollment forms, the purpose of this document is to show best practices to help guide creators of PSP enrollment forms. So this is a guide. It's not a be-all and end-all, but it's really something for any of you who are looking at creating a form, updating a form, thinking about how to bring some standardization. There's some best practices you can follow here. So the objective I went over. The best practices in this document were identified through research and represent a step forward in standardizing parts of the form. And as we mentioned, enrollment form standardization will contribute to increased efficiencies and reduce administrative burden for enrollment form users and help improve the quality of the information collected on the EFs. So it's understood as well, very important, that each PSP and its corresponding enrollment form may have unique requirements. And these best practices are for consideration only. They don't constitute formal guidelines. And I'll just mention that we had a lot of discussion around, is there potential to make one enrollment form for all programs? And truly, that's not the path that we were able to go down, and we don't think that's appropriate because there are differences, through therapeutic area or between drug to drug and the patient populations that are being treated as well. So, really the first step here is around moving towards standardization, and these are considerations when developing the forms. Okay, so I'll just read these 7, and then Arif is going to take us through the details. It's much shorter than the earlier part. So there were 7 best practices that were identified. 1 is use standardized section titles. And number 2, only include fields that correspond to the section title in the section. So no mixing. Those 2 you will see together in just a moment. Number 3, use the standardized date format, day, month, year, to indicate it on the form. So 2 days, 3 characters for the month, and 4 for the year is a best practice. Minimize open-ended responses. 5, state the form version number and the date of the latest version update on the form. 6, encourage the use and transmission of digital versions of forms. And 7, use plain language in the consent. Okay, Arif, I'll pass it back to you.
Perfect, thank you. So best practice number 1, use standardized section titles. And the titles are listed on the right, the 10. Through the analysis, we looked at which ones were used most often, and the group, the PSP Leaders Forum, through discussion there, we came up with these 10. Note that all 10 sections are not required for each enrollment form. So someone creating a new form would just select the sections that apply to meet the requirements of their program. Standardized section titles create consistency for the users of the form. And just reading one example of what we saw, the prescription information was called RX, prescription, prescribing physician section, physician orders, prescribing physician pharmacy use, RX information, dosing information. So lots of different names. So we thought an easy one, just standardized to these 10 names, only including the sections that you need. Best practice number 2, this is key, like only include fields that correspond to the section title in the section. So no mixing of fields. As we saw in that example earlier, the MS patient information had medical fields and so on. So only having fields in the section related to the section title will provide consistency to the users of the forms. The fields in the section correspond to the title. The form users will know which type of information goes in which section in a predictable way. And then the last point there shows the patient information section having the different types of information in it. So EDSS score, that field for MS was a great example, I thought, where the nurse would have to see where that score goes on the form, and it's many different spots depending on the form, the drug and the form. So that could easily, that's a medical field, be in the medical information in the same section. That field is there for all 14 forms.
Arif, there's a question. Would you recommend the same order as we see here on the far right? So the recommended section titles, is that the order it should appear in the form?
We didn't create an order, a recommendation for order, but it's a good question. We thought about it, but we just stopped here with the title.
Okay.
Sometimes even the consent, like patient consent, prescriber consent, was on page 2. So we just didn't go that far. Okay, so Next page. So within those 10 sections, the PSP Leaders Forum, we thought we need more detail for this to be an effective tool for everyone to use. So we went through and listed some more detail below each section. So what types of things would go in each section? So patient information, name, address, gender, contact information, voicemail, date of birth. And each date you're going to see that a format specified. So not all forms, but some forms actually had next to the date field the format that they were looking for. Health card number, caregiver information. So all of that in patient information. Medical includes diagnosis, medical history, medical scale scores, allergies, prescription, dosing and repeats. Prescriber is, I think that one's obvious. Consent is easy, again, with the date and the format specified. Patient consent. So in their option to accept verbal consent, because we did see that on some forms, so having that in the patient consent. The last line of that is going to move, that shouldn't be there, the secure transmission. Special instructions, so we did see on some forms a blank area, so a free text field, but there were cases we thought where that's required. So that's just a blank area. PSP services, so that's specific to the drug and the PSP. Some have self-injection training, nursing, tests, supplies, etc. Medical clearance, some drugs require this. Treatment eligibility tests. Is patient medically cleared to start treatment? Date patient can start treatment. And finally, insurance information. So depending on the drug, private insurance plan information, and possibly public as well.
Okay, thanks, Arif. I'm going to just address a couple of the comments in the chat. So one of the questions that we had here is, have you identified any patterns between the forms regarding what required fields are versus non-required fields? So that's an interesting question. And I think, when we showed you earlier the analysis of the MS, those 14 forms, and even in patient information, like there was a drop off of some information was included in there and not. I think that's why we wanted to keep the best practices pretty open in terms of just starting with some standardization of the section titles and some thematically how you can move towards standardizing the form. We didn't do that analysis about what fields are required versus not. I think that we require having gone to the HCPs and discussing it at the next level. So that wasn't the goal of this practice, but really I think maybe that's good for creators of the forms to be challenging yourselves. Is this something that we really need to include in the form or not, seeing that they're quite information heavy. So I don't have an academic answer for you, but that's sort of where we stop with this analysis. And then a second question that we have here, are all of these best practices PAB approved? Were all forms used in the review PAB approved? So we did look, it wasn't a formalized part of this analysis, but we did look, and about half 50% of forms are PAB approved and 50% are not. So yeah, that's where we left it at that. And one more question here. Have you engaged with patient communities in figuring out the info in the enrollment forms? Arif, and you know what? We'll talk about that in a moment. Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't include anyone from patient communities, but myself and Allison, this project started. What was it? When was that, Allison? 2023.
Yeah.
So starting in 2024, any new projects that we do have a patient rep on them from the start, not feedback at the end. But in this one started earlier, so we did not have a patient rep included.
Okay, let's keep going because we're almost through the best practices, and then we can get to the discussion with everyone. So Arif, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, so best practice number 3, use a standardized date format. Allison mentioned, the month is 3 characters. Having the day as 2 characters and the month as 3 will prevent confusion and errors. This is from an experienced data person that we consulted, and they said this format is preferred. The group, we had a lot of discussion on the date format, but if it's written this way, you can imagine there's no confusion, right? Which is the month and which is the day. Best practice number 4, minimize open-ended responses. Use checkboxes and radio buttons when possible to streamline data collection and reduce variability. Number 5, state the form version number and the date of the latest version update on the form. So having old forms in circulation is not a good thing, and definitely some forms did not have any dates on them. Number 6, encourage the use of and transmission of digital versions of forms. So examples include fillable PDFs, programmable PDFs, online forms. When the information is typed instead of handwritten, so the quality will increase, less errors. Digitals can include form controls, such as drop-down menus for available field choices, which will increase speed in filling out the forms and quality of the data. And that other point, just ensure secure transmission of any form submitted digitally by email.
Okay, thanks.
Good.
I'll just point out around best practice number 3, it did come up that, sometimes it's not possible to use this date format, the 2 days and the month. And somebody asked the question, like the MMM, what is that? Like it would be January, JAN, for example. So, sometimes IT systems are set up in a way that's not possible. We totally understand that. It's just that this is the best practice. So if you're able to go towards that format, that's what's recommended. Okay, so final.
And just to
sorry.
clarify on that form, like typing, it's like imagine a handwritten form or typed in form. It's like having the month in 3 digits. Whether on the other end it's interfaced into another system and translated into whatever the format is in that date system, still works.
Perfect. Okay, so over to you, Arif. Last best practice.
Yeah, and number 7. So although it was not in the scope of the project, we were looking at page 1 of the form, not page 2. We had discussions in the leaders forum about the consent. And since we had all these forms, it was pretty obvious that the consent varied as well quite a bit. So for now, we wanted to include best practice number 7, using plain language for consent. In general, it was observed each consent was in legal formats, well, not all of them, but for sure all of them were reviewed by a lawyer, but some were quite legalized. And we're partway through this other project, and some consents, although one page, are double the words in a tiny font than another compared to another consent, and cover off what appeared to be the same information. So I think there's a huge opportunity. We thought there was a huge opportunity, the whole group, that using plain language so that patients understand what they're signing. One stat here, according to the Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance survey, 57% of patients understood the consent on the enrollment form. So even that is higher than I would have guessed, but 57%. Use plain language to simplify the consent. To be more patient-centric, design the consent with the average Canadian health literacy level. Patient registry consent guidelines may also be considered. So having it in legal format, complex, just because we're doing this other project, what grade level is the wording of the consent, and there are ways to check. So in the other project, we're hoping to provide everyone like a way to grade your consent. Like is it good for plain language or not?
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Arif. Okay, so we have the 7 best practices here, just as a recap that we've taken you through, and then I've shared, the link to this document is already published, and that's available for you guys. And I'll send it to you again through email after this session. Just in a question of time, I think, thank you so much, guys, for all of your questions in the chat. That's fantastic. And what I'd like to do now is move on to the panel discussion to hear from the experts that we have. So Lisa, Julien, Alan, and Dorothy, I'd love to invite you just to come back onto your video. And I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint for just a second, and then we'll have a little bit of a chat about all of this. So I know there's a lot of information there, and I want to thank everyone on the line for being able to sort of stick with us this far and get through all of those details. So let's just talk a little bit about what we heard. And really my first question is, we already went through all of these best practices and what's going on, but I'm curious to hear from each of you, in your experience to date, have there been issues with a lack of standardization with the PSP enrollment forms? And what are you hearing either from HCPs or end users or patients interfacing with the forms? Has this been an issue? And you know what, I'm going to throw it first to Lisa, because we had a great question from around engaging patients, and I really want to hear from Lisa on this around, is this a problem, the standardization piece, and what your experience has been?
Yeah, that question was from my buddy Lori. Way to go, Lori. Yeah, so I'm so glad you did this research, because I find it fascinating, actually, that there's so much, discrepancy between the forms. The one thing I want to point out is that, although that these forms are inconsistent, they're also inconsistent in terms of how patients interact with them as well, right? And so sometimes we get a great person like Alan to help us, right? And sometimes we're actually have to fill it out ourselves. And so that inconsistency can be a problem. So what I've been hearing, so I hear from patients who find the forms onerous, really hard to fill out. Other patients whose doctors find them onerous and hard to fill out. And then what happens is that, usually one of two things: either the clinician kind of is like, oh, these are such a drag. Maybe I'm not going to share. I mean, this is the worst case scenario, but maybe I'm not going to share, right, information about that PSP with the patient because it's a pain in the butt to fill out the forms. Or, on the flip side is leaving the patient to figure out how to fill it out themselves. Right. And then we know that there are lots of issues associated with that. Like when a patient is filling out a patient support form or need access to a patient support program, they're, vulnerable, right? And super worried and all of those things. And so, they're also being forced to fill out this a very confusing form in a time of stress. And then the other side of it is we do hear a lot from doctors as well, right, who say kind of the same thing. And I know Alan will probably say the same thing, but just that they're really hard to fill out, and it doesn't make them all excited about these enrollment forms, right?
Okay, thanks, Lisa, for sharing that. Maybe I'll just send it right over to Alan to pick up on that. You filled out a lot of forms in your lifetime.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I do agree with everything Lisa said. I think the knock-on effect of having a lack of standardization is that the programs that you're sending these enrollment forms into then has to reach back out and say, can you clarify this? You didn't fill out this part of the form. And that part it's not like you get an instant response from these programs. They can take a few days. So instead of having your patient start on drug in a day or two, now you have to answer these follow-up questions because they weren't on the enrollment form, or they were incomplete on the enrollment form. The PSP now can't proceed, and patient doesn't get drug for now over a week. So the knock-on effects of having this lack of standardization is things just take longer and longer. So it's very serious.
Okay, thanks for that. So I'm hearing, yes, that like the lack of standardization, difficult to fill out, but then also creating, delays in access, even though
Exactly.
we didn't measure that, but from your experience. Okay, so Julien, I'll pass it over to you. I'm so curious from the manufacturer perspective, is this lack of standardization something that you've been thinking about, and how is it impacting things from your perspective?
We would get, anecdotal evidence that there was perhaps friction in having to deal with different forms. Now, we would focus internally a lot on our own little portfolio. Okay, are our forms harmonious and uniform, but I think this research at least gives us like a higher level view of across therapeutical areas, across manufacturers, this level of non-uniformity created much more friction than I think I was aware of. And I think it was very self-centered for us, but we were, as I said, really focused on what we were doing and not necessarily taking the end user experience in consideration enough.
Okay, interesting. Thank you for that. And that's perfect. There's an audience question that asked, just that, like, what were the discussions like with manufacturers, and how do you perceive a standardized patient support program enrollment form? And what is your belief on the impact on patient engagement and program efficiency? Has that been something that, I guess you just said that it was maybe anecdotal, but are those conversations that you've been having, looking at your own portfolio of forms, perhaps?
Yeah, since your research, obviously, this has become a topic of interest for us. Looking at our past forms against kind of the guidelines or exoskeleton that was shared by Arif and yourself, and see if, as an industry, we can get together, collaborate on having a standard approach. I think we can get into this at a later point, but there's tremendous efficiency in having a standard approach like this. We know our system desperately needs it. So yeah, we're definitely, at least on our side, on board with this. It's just going to take a little bit of work, but I'm sure if we all roll up our sleeves, we're able to align on a one direction with our forms.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for that. So I'll pass over to Dorothy. Dorothy, from an agency perspective, you're designing and creating these forms on behalf of your manufacturer clients. So I'm curious, has this come up in the past around, like, what is the experience of creating one of these forms? And I'm almost imagining this might not be the sexiest design request that you're receiving. So yeah, I'd love to hear from your perspective.
Yes, but you need to have a really good designer to make these look great, because obviously the content and the requirements are driven by the manufacturer who administers the PSP. And we certainly do find, working across different therapeutic areas and brands, pretty much all the forms that we create are all different. There are areas where, if we're working on multiple brands within the same therapeutic area, that as the agency, we have taken the opportunity to template the forms a little bit. So certainly not try to standardize in the way you did, although same thing. Now we've had that discussion at the agency, if that's something we can carry it forward. But again, within brands, within the same therapeutic area, we have templated them really so that they look the same. And that patients and the doctors certainly who are using them, that there's some level of maybe recognition that it's coming from the same manufacturer, same PSP, even though the drug may be different. But we're certainly having to squeeze a lot of information. I think that is the biggest challenge, because as we saw, there's so much information to include. Often the requirement is, or even the ask from the manufacturers, can you make this one page, which is really difficult to do, right? To make it look good, legible, have the fields big enough to be fillable. So often if there's consent required as well, then as you noted as well, it goes on to page 2, but certainly not longer than that.
Okay, very interesting. I'm going to pick up on something that was mentioned in the chat around perhaps that the marketing teams at manufacturers feel that an enrollment form is a marketing one more than an operational one. They have marketing in their title. I'm curious, Dorothy, if you've seen that like perspective coming through around like trying to differentiate, et cetera, with this form versus conversation perhaps around how can we make this the most efficient possible for the end user.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. Is it a competitive differentiation? I mean, I don't think so. Maybe Julien can comment on that a little bit more. Certainly the PSP itself maybe can be, if doctors have a good experience with one, PSP over another. I don't think the form itself drives that. But sometimes, depending on the type of consent that's required, where they can differentiate is then the follow-on to that. Would they like to do, market research with patients? Is there email marketing, other materials and information that then the manufacturer would like to send the patient? So some forms do have that, some not. So then you can look at that, if patients, doctors, et cetera, are given consent, then there is a continued engagement that can happen then between the manufacturer and the patient or HCP, which could be, may be considered a competitive differentiation if there is that engagement.
Okay, thanks for that. I saw Julien, you want to jump in with a comment perhaps?
Sure. It's gonna suck in terms of its answer, but it's gonna differ from manufacturer and their philosophy on how they treat PSPs. I can only speak for the organization that I work with, but considering it's post-prescription, we treat it as a non-differentiator. It shouldn't influence the prescription habits, so we don't necessarily use marketing tactics around our PSP forms and our PSP as a brand per se. However, I'm sure it can differentiate. It can differ depending on the manufacturer and also maybe the therapeutical area. I'll stop at that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to put you on the hot seat because there's a question, maybe a little bit of an interesting one in the chat. So do you think manufacturers like yourself will be willing to surrender control over to the PSPs to streamline, standardize, and simplify forms? Some interesting language there. What do you think, Julien?
Interesting language per se, yes. However, I'm all on board for efficiency gain. If there's a way to identify opportunities to create efficiency in the process, I can once again only speak for myself. I'm not the representative of the industry. However, I think people in my seats would typically prioritize this. So yeah, I'm hopeful for that.
Okay, great. I'm going to come back to Alan. There's a question in the chat. So in your experience, what instances would a patient be completing an enrollment form versus the DAN or physician? And maybe just in your answer of that, we can talk a little bit about, these more detailed experience of filling out these forms and how you feel that the best practices could potentially impact that experience.
I think in oncology, at least, it's typically a DAN or the physician or pivot nurse or whatever, like an HCP who's filling the forms out. Some programs do allow self-enrollment, though. So in those cases, you could have a patient filling out their own form, saves the physician time or the healthcare provider time, but then they know what to include like on the form when they submit it. So I do think having patients self-enroll is probably a bit of a can of worms and could lead to problems. But when it comes to my experience filling them out, like at least in oncology again, we always filled them out for patients. Like that would just be the expectation. Oftentimes when I would meet a patient who is going to be needing a PSP, they were quite raw emotionally, and it wasn't really something else to add to their plate to deal with. There's really a battle when it comes to designing these forms of like collecting as much information as possible for the PSP, but also making it short enough for a DAN or a physician to deal with their busy day. So I've been involved with a lot of PSP development over time where we want to include more fields and make it longer so that it's one submission to the PSP vendor, but then the HCPs only fill out 10% of the form because they don't have time. So I know the norm in Canada is like 2, maybe 3 pages long, but the US enrollment forms I've seen are like 6, 7 pages long. They have lots and lots of details. So I think we have this sort of balancing act here. We want to have tick boxes and make things really short, but then you don't get that same level of data given to the program. And again, then they're going to reach out to you. So whatever you don't put on the form or you compromise there, it just leads to another interaction with the PSP in a few days. So, how do you balance that?
Yeah, thanks for that perspective. It's so interesting. And I want to pick up on a question that we had. I believe this was from Charlotte earlier, and I said I would come back to it. So she had said, I recently spoke to 7 drug access navigators across the country, and they all wanted the form to be short and concise. So we heard you just say that. And what do you recommend to exclude what is extra and non-needed? So I know we didn't pull out this level of analysis in the research that we did, but I'm so curious anecdotally for you, are there things that when filling out the form or now creating new forms in your current role that are just obvious to you that it's like we should scrap this, it's not important? And is that something that could be perhaps a best practice or added to that best practice?
Yeah, it's quite a balancing act. So I've seen enrollment forms where it's the patient name and a phone number, and that's all they had time to do, right? So oftentimes, like from my experience, and a lot of DANs are usually scrambling to fill these forms out as fast as possible. So there's not this like casually sit down and get your pen and fill out the form and take your time. It's usually I have to get this form in because I have to do the next form and the next form, the next form, and then I have to go and see that patient, fill out 4 more forms, maybe get a lunch break today, but it's usually like as fast as you can go. So unfortunately, it's dealing with that reality. Like in cancer clinics, people are scrambling quite a lot. So when it comes to what is required, name and phone number, I can collect the rest later. Technically, when we get enrollment forms like that on my program, it just means a very long welcome call to the patient, right? Like we end up having to say, I need this detail, this detail, this detail, because it wasn't on the enrollment form. So it ends up being passed along to somebody else. So at the same time, if you put that onto the enrollment form and you make it a required data point or something like that, you don't end up with people always filling out what you need. So what is the minimum standard? Well, maybe the DAN did the insurance investigation, so it's not needed on the enrollment form. But another HCP might say, well, I want the PSP to call the patient's private insurance. So then you need the policy number and the certificate number and all of these other details. So it really depends. What's the minimum is very case by case.
Okay, thank you. It's like the non-standard question, in the end, it's going to be case by case, but okay. Very good. Thanks for that. Lisa, I'd like to come to you now. Really, a similar question to what I just asked to Alan is like, in your experience in filling out these forms, where do you see these best practices potentially impacting that experience? And I know we had a question from the chat where they were just asking, the individual was asking, like, when would a patient be filling out the form on their own? And I'm curious, in your experience, when have you seen that happening? So a couple questions in there for you.
Yeah, so I'll start with the filling out the forms. So I think that Alan's right. I think in the larger centers, in the larger cancer centers, there's usually a medication reimbursement specialist or a DAN that would help a patient. Clinicians, I hear increasingly much rare. It's much more rare that they would actually help fill it out, but I do hear a lot of stories from oncology patients with lots of questions. They're either self-enrolling, like they'll be sitting there self-enrolling in front of this form with all these questions and they don't know, and they're upset, and like Alan commented, feeling raw, right? And so I think that happens a lot more than we think. And I don't know if there's a particular situation, it might be the center, it might be the hospital. I think it could be the doctor in some cases as well. And just I don't know. I don't know if anyone on the call wants to weigh in on this on the panel, but I think that's the perception from clinicians generally about PSPs is kind of like peaks and valleys, and probably mostly valleys, right? In terms of just having to do anything with it at all, right? In terms of their participation. I can't remember your first question.
I think one of them was around integrating these best practices into it. Like, how did you think this can start to move the needle? Maybe like coming out of those valleys a little bit and moving towards something.
Yeah. So
I
think we can see this sort of the theme in the chat. I think in just following the best practices, figuring out a way to make everything the same, that would be really great. I think it would really benefit patients in a number of ways. Like, first of all, in the ease of understanding, no sweat there. For people who do Alan's job, right? Like Alan and all the great work that his team does. He's really right. They don't have time to eat lunch. Imagine if we could make it so streamlined, right, that it's clockwork. And there was a question about delays, and I've actually heard of where it happens quite often, where the information is not filled out properly because it's not streamlined, and then it's sitting on someone's desk, right? And then the patient's asking, where is it? And then the DAN finds it sitting on, wherever it needs to be, so that they can find extra information. And so we need those kinds of situations not to be happening, because patients need their drugs as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, I want to come back. I see we have about 15 minutes left in the webinar, so maybe we can look a little bit about future state, and I will come to Dorothy again. And Dorothy, I know that from the agency perspective, I'm curious, what would you like to see and as in a future state for PSP enrollment forms, or maybe even the way that you work with the different stakeholders? And, are curious again about best practices, but really open to other ideas around potential future research that is needed or things that are needed, from your perspective to improve this space.
Mm-hmm. No, good. I think I have three things. One, just because we spent so much time talking about standardization. I mean, I do think it's certainly possible to do that. Even, we have style guides, for example, for every single brand that we develop materials for. So having these kinds of best practices, we can then incorporate into the style guides. We have an internal med reg team that makes sure that, everything is followed. So I think that's certainly something that, we can incorporate this and then make sure everything is consistent. Going forward as well, it was touched on digitization of these forms. So not all, most do have like a digital PDF, which that's great, but sometimes have also heard that it's difficult for patients to be able to fill out that PDF. So maybe also going forward, could it be an online form where it's actually filled out online and then gets sent directly to the PSP? That could be something that's considered. And then thirdly, also was touched on PAB. We also find, depending on who we're working with, some of the forms require PAB review and approval. And again, that's not our choice. That is manufacturer compliance. Other forms do not. So, and obviously that's a timing issue as well. So it's making me think, can these best practices and standardization, and could we have a conversation with PAB, either all the forms go to PAB or none of the forms go to PAB, that would also be part of standardizing them and, kind of agencies, all manufacturers doing the same thing. So PAB, can we do them online? And if we standardize, then we can incorporate into a type of style guide so that they do look and feel the same.
Okay, thank you for that, Dorothy. And I would just appreciate as well, as I hear you start using these best practices, perhaps in the next couple of forms that you're using, feel free to provide feedback, because we'd love to make sure that we're updating them and evolving as everyone, all the different stakeholders need them. So yeah, thank you so much for your perspectives. I'm going to come over to Julien. And really, same question for you. Like, how do you see this space of PSP enrollment forms evolving? We heard that there's over 400 programs, maybe more, and it could be even more forms than that. What do you see for yourself, maybe in your own organization, and future state for your hopes for maybe the whole industry?
Well, once again, I don't think I'd like to speak just for myself, but if as an industry we're able to somehow get together and look at this as a way of streamlining processes and reducing perhaps the likelihood of errors, then I think it's a worthy endeavor to look back on our past forms and integrate maybe this guidelines for future forms so that we can get closer to providing at least a consistent and somewhat reliable method for enrolling patients. I think the quality of patient support will definitely benefit from that. So I think, just taking a step back from just our own little system and looking at this as an industry-wide approach. I understand there will be unique fields in different therapeutical areas, but if we have an overall general direction to thrive for, please, that's a great step in the first step in the right direction. And I think that's feasible. So great work, actually, on your research.
I love it. Glass half full. Yeah. Okay, we're counting on you to take the lead, Julien, on this applying these standards. Okay, I'll come over to Alan. And, again, future looking, how do these best practices fit in? What future research is needed? And what are your hopes for decreasing administrative burden with PSP enrollment forms?
Well, there's definitely a lot of opportunity to improve things. I would say there's definitely a lot of places to fix some of these processes. Like in my mind, I like tools like OKRX and Oxida, where they can do digital enrollments. They have all the enrollments in one platform, and then they can control, like, this field has to be completed before you can proceed, so you can avoid some of those errors. I would love to see, like, there's a comment in the chat about EHRs. If there was a way to have these forms in these tools, like in these platforms for submissions, that would talk to the hospital's charting systems. that would mean I could maybe click a tab, like in my hospital, we use Cerner. So you click a tab in the EHR, open the Pfizer enrollment form, and it would just fill in everything, right? It would fill in the patient demographics and everything. We just pull it from the EHR. And, it could be mapped out to pull all sorts of information that's relevant. So then from an administrative perspective, it's maybe just a few clicks and it's done. So then it's not this like 15-minute process of filling out a form and potentially making mistakes, but it's just a few clicks in the platform and it's submitted. Like that would be a really nice game changer if it could do that. And at least the information is not being transcribed manually. It's just being pulled from somewhere else in the tool. I really hope we can get to some point tools like that.
Okay, thank you. And last but not least, Lisa, what aspirations do you see for this space and healthcare administrative burden in general?
Yeah, I think I have just one thing. I think we should. Lori brought it up, but we really should have patients engaged in the development of the forms. What questions do we ask? What's the experience like? I think that would go far, and not only in improving outcomes and care and all of that stuff, but just kind of factoring in the patient into this very, very complicated and already onerous system.
Okay, thank you for that. Before we end the panel portion of this, I'm just curious if there's any final words that any of you have or things that we didn't cover. And I'll just mention that I see from the chat there was a lot of questions around the opportunities to use AI to develop standardized forms, portals, EMRs. I'm sorry we're not getting to all of those different topics. I think they each warrant like a robust discussion on their own, but I really appreciate the questions that everyone's put here for the panelists and through the chat. So yeah, any final things you'd like to mention? Any burning things on your heart before we move on to just closing this session today? Okay, Alan?
I do have one comment.
Go ahead, yeah.
So I like how Julien said they're going to, talk about this internally and see what we can do to implement some of these things. I want to recommend that to everyone who's on this call. If you're part of a manufacturer or a vendor who supports patient support programs, to book a meeting with your management and review these. See when you can implement these, at your next meeting, your next revision, and have a serious discussion about these. It's definitely needed.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to, huge round of applause for the panel. Thank you so much for your insights and your time and being with us here today. I know there's quite a few questions we didn't get to. I'll go back and pull those out, and if there's anything that we can share or discuss further, I will make sure that I connect with all of you. So we have just a few minutes left in this session. I'm going to pull the slides back up. Once again, thank you so much to the panelists for being with us here today. So for everyone that's still on the line, you brave souls who've made it over an hour here, I just want to share with you a couple of additional resources on PSP best practices. So the two pieces that we reviewed today have actually been published. So the research part has been published in a poster you see here on the left, and that's available. The link is there for you, but also I'll send this back to you after. So if you want to get back into those details, you'll have these slides and the poster that's already available, as well as feel free to reach out to myself and Arif if you have any questions about the methodology or even more detailed questions. I saw a few come through in the chat. And then the considerations when developing PSP enrollment forms document is also available. And that has all of the details that you saw today about those 7 best practices to consider for creators of PSP forms, or if you're trying to move towards standardization, which is going to be led by Julien in the industry-wide, we now heard. Just kidding, Julien. Also, just as I mentioned off the top, that there's quite a few other resources that have been developed for patient support program standards and data from the PSP Leaders Forum. So you can also find online this package of work that was done on framework and considerations for collecting real-world data with patient support programs. So there's just some high-level work that's been done on looking at how to collect data, how to address trust and bias issues when collecting data through PSPs, and also data quality considerations. So the links are there. I'll send those links out again for you guys. Yeah, please feel free to consult these. They're all in the public domain, and we really hope that anyone working in this space can, help or use them, that will help them get towards, advancing the capabilities in the PSP space for Canada. Finally, there's also a peer-reviewed publication around the current state of PSP real-world data collection. So if you want to take a look at that, it's more of an academic approach or overview of what's going on in our country today. There's been quite a bit. We're up to about, I think, 22, 23 peer-reviewed publications, so that's in the public domain, that have gone through academic review using patient support program data to generate real-world evidence. Different topic. Finally, I'd just like to call out, the Patient Support Program Leaders Forum members, and really a huge thanks for the support and guidance in terms of developing this research. You guys will see more coming out from this group on PSP data and PSP best practices throughout the year and into next year as well. So for all the organizations involved with this, I'd love to thank you again for your continued support. And just finally, a huge thank you to all of you that are on the line today. Some dense material off the top, and I think it was really lightened up by the panelists that were here, and it's always awesome to get everyone's perspectives. I'd also love to thank the OPMA, the Ontario Pharmaceutical Marketing Association, who helped us reach out to everyone to be involved with this. So thank you so much for that support. And also to my colleague, Arif Mitha, who presented the research. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'm giving you 4 minutes back. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And let's get to work on standardizing and improving the admin burden for everyone. Okay, have a great day.